Have you ever just sat quietly? Maybe it's late at night and you're looking back at a destructive habit, or maybe a sudden, totally inexplicable burst of anger you had that day, or just a deep-seated anxiety that never seems to leave you. And you think to yourself, is this just who I am? Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to sit with a really heavy, deeply human anxiety. It's that quiet, terrifying fear that we are somehow fundamentally broken machines, that our wiring is just flawed. But over the next few minutes, we're going to completely dismantle a terrifying scientific myth. We're going to explore exactly why your genes are absolutely not the dictators of your life, and why they desperately, literally, need the right environment to become your fate.
It's actually incredibly common to feel this profound psychological dread about our own biology. So many of us walk around carrying this silent weight, right? Wondering, am I fundamentally ruined by my childhood trauma? Is my DNA just some kind of curse that I have to live with forever? We look back at our family tree, or we look at the really tough hardships we endured early in life, and we feel this overwhelming sense of genetic fatalism. It feels as though our destiny was entirely written in stone long before we even had a chance to speak. And I want to say, that is a completely valid, deeply immersive fear to have. But modern biology, it tells a radically different and honestly, a far more deeply encouraging story.
Let's dive right into part one, the myth of hardwiring. Neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky argues something that is actually quite counterintuitive to almost everything we are casually taught about genetics. We so often hear DNA described as a master blueprint. It implies there's this grand architect who has drawn up the final, completely unchangeable plans for a house, and your cellular builders just blindly follow it no matter what. But this is the absolute fallacy of genetic fatalism. It tricks us into thinking our behavior is permanently hardwired. The truth? DNA is not a blueprint, not even close. It's much more accurate to think of DNA as a conditional potential. It is absolutely not a predetermined destiny. A gene doesn't just spontaneously decide to wake up, turn on, and dictate that you're going to be aggressive or depressed or anxious. It literally cannot do that. It requires a specific instruction from the outside world first. Okay, so to really grasp this counterintuitive biological reality, we need to look at something called transcription factors. Think of these as cellular proteins that act basically like environmental if-then switches. Imagine a single gene as a dormant seed just buried deep in the soil. It contains all the potential in the world to grow into a massive plant, but it cannot and will not do a single thing until it gets water, sunlight, and nutrients. The transcription factor is the biological mechanism that senses that sunlight. It introduces this brilliant, almost cinematic if-then clause right into our biology. The rule is simple. If this specific environment is present, then and only then activate this gene. Let's walk through this micro to macro process really slowly, just to let it fully sink in. Picture a mother holding her newborn baby. Step 1, an environmental trigger occurs. She leans in and smells the scent of her baby's head. Those tiny odorant molecules float into her nose and bind to receptors. Step 2, deep inside her brain, this specific sensory information activates a specific transcription factor. Step 3, that transcription factor travels down, binds to her DNA, and turns on a specific gene. In this case, the gene that produces oxytocin, the hormone we associate with deep bonding and love. The crazy part? Without that external sensory world, literally without the physical smell of the baby, that specific gene remains entirely silent, totally dark, and completely inactive. And this brilliantly illustrates just how insanely dependent our DNA is on the physical world around us. 4 million, let that number land for a second. That is the staggering, almost unbelievable number of transcription factor binding sites contained within the human genome. Our DNA is absolutely covered head to toe in these environmental if-then switches. This definitively proves the sheer magnitude of how our environment, and we mean everything from the basic nutrients floating inside our cells, to the smell of someone we love, right up to the massive cultural shifts we live through, literally regulates our biology. So that leads us perfectly into our next section, the warrior gene fallacy. So you might be wondering, if genes are really just sitting there waiting for instructions, why on earth are we so afraid of them? Well, enter the MAOA variant. You've probably heard it called by its truly terrifying nickname, the warrior gene. Over the years, the media built up this enormous, almost suffocating sense of deterministic dread around this specific gene. They asked this deeply unsettling question. Can a single microscopic gene actually manufacture an entire antisocial, violent personality? The narrative became so incredibly strong and so fatalistic that the mere presence of this gene has actually been used successfully in real courtrooms to lessen prison sentences for convicted murderers. The core argument was literally, if you have this gene, you are chemically fated to be uncontrollably violent. It's exactly the kind of story that makes us deeply question all those hidden, uncontrollable forces lurking inside our own biology.
But here is the incredibly blunt, wonderfully, scientifically rigorous punchline to that entire terrifying narrative, straight from Robert Sapolsky himself. He says, "Warrior gene, my ass." It's such a great moment of necessary scientific humor because it completely highlights just how utterly absurd and totally reductive the whole warrior gene myth truly is, and we are going to completely dismantle it right now.
To find the definitive slam dunk proof that dismisses this myth, we have to look back at a truly groundbreaking study published in 2002 by researcher of Shalom Caspi. His team did something incredible. They exhaustively tracked a massively large cohort of individuals over decades. They literally started at birth. As these kids grew up, the researchers carefully observed their childhood environments, and they were specifically looking for cases of severe abuse versus highly secure, safe settings. Then they waited. At age 26, they measured their adult antisocial behavior. The burning question was, did having that infamous MAOA gene actually dictate their fate?
Let's actually take a long, deep pause right here to truly let this comparison sink in. On the one hand, individuals who carry the MAOA variant and who also experience severe childhood abuse showed a massive exponential spike in antisocial behavior as adults. Their risk of violence absolutely skyrocketed. But look at the other side. Individuals who carried the exact same genetic marker, the exact same so-called warrior gene, but who were raised in a secure, supportive environment, showed a totally normal, completely subclinical temperament, sometimes even better social stability than average. The gene did absolutely nothing on its own. This definitively proves that the risk of violence spikes only when the gene is paired with severe trauma. A secure environment didn't just slightly lessen the risk of the warrior gene, it neutralized it entirely.
Which brings us to Section 3, sensitivities, not destinies. This brings us to a really profound shift in how we need to view ourselves. The absolutely crucial point to take away is this. Genetics confer sensitivities to our surroundings. They do not confer absolute, inescapable fates. If you happen to carry the MAOA variant, you are not destined to be a violent person. Not at all. Rather, your brain is simply more vulnerable, more exquisitely sensitive to the toxic effects of an abusive childhood. It's a vulnerability literally just sitting there, waiting for an environment. In a healthy, loving environment, that exact same genetic trait might just manifest as a perfectly normal, maybe slightly driven temperament. The takeaway here is huge. Your genes do not dictate your life. They dictate how intensely you will respond to the life around you. Now, having said all that, we absolutely must validate the real pain that so many people feel. Because you might be asking, if it's just an environment, why does my trauma feel so totally inescapable? Well, this requires us to unpack a fascinating concept called epigenetics. Epigenetics basically refers to environmental effects that can essentially freeze those genetic on-off switches we talked about, freezing them in a very specific position. If a child experiences constant, severe adversity, the environment sends these persistent, non-stop signals to their DNA, freezing certain stress response genes directly in the on position. It literally forms a biological memory of the trauma. And this is exactly why childhood trauma feels so deeply ingrained, because it literally alters how your genes are being regulated. But, and this is the most important part, we must remind ourselves, this is still just an environmental interaction. It is a biological memory. It is not a permanent, unchangeable curse. And that leads us to our final part, rewriting your environment. Because our genes are constantly, endlessly listening to our environment, we actually have a very real, scientifically grounded pathway to change. We have to consciously look at the macro and the micro environmental factors that we can actually curate in our adult lives. First, we have to honestly identify our trigger environments. These are spaces characterized by persistent uncertainty, unpredictable threats, or really poor social modeling. If you know you have genetic sensitivities or you know you have early trauma, you have to understand that these chaotic environments are going to turn on those defensive survival genes. Conversely, we must actively, intentionally build what we call regrowth environments. These are spaces deeply anchored in secure relationships, highly consistent positive reinforcement, and real physical and emotional safety. By truly understanding our own biological triggers, we can consciously construct and seek out environments where our nervous system finally realizes the threat has passed. And that is what allows us to safely heal and completely transform. To perfectly synthesize our entire journey today, we come right back to this foundational, scientifically rigorous truth from Robert Sapolsky. He says, genes don't make sense outside the context of environment. I really want you to hear that, You are not a broken machine. You are not completely doomed by your past, and you are absolutely not cursed by some static, unchangeable blueprint. Your biology is deeply, remarkably malleable. It's fluid. Your DNA is really just this dynamic, living script that is constantly, eagerly waiting for the very next line of dialogue from the world around you. Take a moment to just sit with the sheer liberation of that thought. That heavy, sinking anxiety you might carry, the fear that you're fundamentally hardwired for failure or pain, you can actually set that down now. Your genes are actively listening right in this very second to the life you are living. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If your genes are truly just waiting around for instructions, what kind of environment are you going to build for them today?